two, one.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are listening to this out there in CSRI. Welcome to our presentation. Welcome to the conference. You know, this is my first CSRI, so I'm pretty excited to be here. And I'm Mary Hums from the University of Louisville, and I am here today with our research team headed by Mr. Nick Swim and joined by our research expert colleague, teammate, Mr. Youngjik Lee. So that will be our presentation team this morning. So we're really happy to be here, and we're going to go ahead and get started. The title of our presentation, Sorry I'm Not From Here. Entschuldigen, ich bin nicht von hier. It's an American accent, but okay, there you go. Female international student athletes transitions to and from college athletics. Next slide, please, Nick. So here's a quote to get us started. International student athletes are transient visitors to our academic communities, and yet they form an integral part of the social, cultural, and academic context of higher education. We all have international students in our programs. We know what they bring. So I want to give you just a little information and some numbers about international student athletes. So first of all, when we look at the NCAA, they have 5 pillars of inclusion. And those are race, ethnicity, women, people with disabilities, the LGBT community, and international. So what we're talking about today fits with one of those 5 pillars of inclusion that the NCAA is setting forth. Now, just to give you an idea of numbers, there are over 20,000 active international student athletes that are competing in NCAA sport. So that's a pretty big number. That's a pretty big number, and that makes this research very relevant. And as a matter of fact, 70% of Division I women's tennis players are international student athletes. They're going to be the population that we're going to be looking at here in this study, so that fits very well. And international student athletes hold unique transition experiences. They're really kind of 3 different transitions. Number 1, they're transitioning from high school to college. Number 2, they're making that transition from one country to the next. And then third, they're making the transition from being a student to now being a student athlete. So there's some unique transition experiences into being a college athlete. And then we're also going to look at what does it mean when an international student athlete transitions out from their career as an NCAA athlete. So I will turn it over next to Nick.
Thank you, Dr. Hums. Well, of course, it's a mute problem. So thank you, Dr. Hums, for that introduction. For this study, we are utilizing the International Student Athlete Adjustment Model that was first introduced by Ringer and Pastor in 2000 and re-examined in 2010 by Pop et al. And so how this looks, the antecedent factors are here on the bottom left, and they include personal, interpersonal, perceptual, and cultural distance as their 4 key tenets to a successful adjustment for international student athletes. So underneath these tenets, for personal, we have individual self-efficacy, technical competencies, travel experience, sense of adventure. And travel experience, sense of adventure were actually added to this adjustment model from Pop et al. In 2010. And then the second tenet, interpersonal, which is teammates, coaches, faculty, and staff. Perceptual is realistic expectations, social support, family influence. And lastly, cultural distance kind of holds a multitude of different experiences, and it's not specific in regards to cultural distance, and cultural experiences are going to be different from home country to United States in comparison. So all of these antecedent factors work up towards this top factor of academic adjustment, social adjustment, athletic adjustment, personal emotional adjustment, and institutional adjustment. All of these leading to this satisfaction of an international student athlete from the athletic perspective, but also the academic perspective as well. So all of these are really driven by these antecedent factors, and that is what we, for this study, are really going to kind of dive into of, are these antecedent factors still relevant today in 2020, 2021 academic higher education NCAA model in comparison to a 2000 and 2010 setting? So while there's been a lot of studies on international student athlete transition experiences in college athletics. However, none of them have really used this model. And so what we're going to do is going to kind of cover some of the variables and frequencies that we see across the literature in international student athlete transitions. So we can kind of help understand what the research says, and we can kind of align that with what we find in this study. So the first one is culture. When we think about culture, there's a unique atmosphere around culture from a home country of an international student athlete to the culture of the United States here. As we know, it is very unique here in the US, especially on a college campus. And so a really important quote from Pierce et al. 2012 is they talk about the distance of culture, distance location-wise, has an effect on this transition in regards to where those individuals are coming from. So they compare this to a Canadian student athlete might have a easier transition to the United States model because location is closer, whereas there's similar context to those the culture that exists here in the United States from Canada in comparison to maybe someone from Europe or maybe someone from Asia or South America in those spaces. So they talk about culture being a really important factor in this transition model. Next, language. Obviously, language is definitely a barrier that exists to the transition experience and does usually lead to a little bit more negative experiences for international student athletes. And it's also unique because when we think about language, language is, again, different in countries. So when we think about it, one international student athlete could have 8 to 10 years of English prep within their high school or middle school experience, whereas you might have an international student athlete with maybe 6 month or one course in English. So when we look at English or the language barrier for transitions, it is going to vary based on the student athlete themselves. Next, education system. As most of us probably know here, the education system here in the US is vastly different than a lot of other countries, especially in regards to athletics. Education athletics being aligned here in the US does create this variability for a lot of international student athletes in understanding what they're coming into in regards to region of the country and the university, GPAs, academic eligibility, athletic eligibility, amateurism, and all the above. Next, recruitment. So there's been a lot of interesting studies in regards to recruitment of international student athletes, looking at how they're contacted, how do they get to the United States to participate on our sport teams. And in difference from domestic student athletes where a coach comes and watches you, you talk to them, you sign maybe a national letter of intent or you commit to that school. International student athletes have to rely on these different avenues, either telecommunication, video chats, and the source of information comes from varying spaces in comparison to domestic student athletes. So maybe a club coach, maybe a coach or a former student athlete that's just in your home country says, hey, I went here, you should talk to this coach. And so the variability that exists at the international student athlete level is vastly different than domestic student athletes. Next, support. Obviously, being in a new country and having this transition process is really important in regards to support. And this was covered in the adjustment model that we talked about before. But when we look at support, it needs to come from a variability of spaces because, as we talked about, the education system has academics and athletics together. So the support, as we've seen, is really important, and not only from coaches and academic support services, but also teammates, other international student athletes, other student athletes, domestic student athletes, and then obviously just the student body itself. So support needs to be there in this space. And a very unique kind of understanding of international student athlete transitions is the idea of first semester first year transitions into a better experience junior and senior year. And we've seen this across the literature. Once international student athletes get through this first year or first semester, they can get a little bit better understanding of what the process looks like and work through that into having positive experiences here in the US. So that is the transition into college. And now into the transition out of college, we see a lot of research in regards to domestic student athlete transitions out of college. There's been a multitude of research. However, there's not a lot on international student athletes transitions out of college. And we'll talk about that here in a second of one of the ones we found. But for domestic student athletes, we can make comparisons. And so a lot of it focuses on this athletic identity crisis. Once I'm done playing sports or I retire from college sports and I'm not going to play professionally, what do I do? How do my identities affect my daily life and my daily activities? And so that is a really big crisis that exists for domestic student athletes in this transition out of college. Next one is support. Where is the support coming from? If you always are relying on your teammates and coaches, and they're not there anymore, where does that support come from? Is it family? Is it outside friends? Are your teammates still there? Where are you living? There's a lot of variability that exists when looking at domestic student athletes transitions. Next, professional development. As we all know here, student athletes are asked to do a lot, 20 hours a week of practice on top of study halls, on top of campus visits, on top of working out. There's a lot of time invested from student athletes, which leads to less internships, less professional development opportunities that exist. So if we can provide more professional development for domestic student athletes, it might lead into a better sense of self or identity in this transition. And so that's a lot of the literature in regards to domestic student athletes transition. But looking at international student athlete transitions out of college, we found one article that really looks at this, and it was from Falls and Wilson in 2013. And it was from Canadian female student athletes. And they talked, similarly to domestic student athletes, of the importance of athlete identity and support. And so these Canadian student athletes were from Canada, came to the US, and then went back to Canada. So they were all not students that stayed in the US. And so their results are pretty similar to the domestic student athletes. However, if we go back to this Pierce et al. Conversation from earlier, is that similar cultures equal easier transitions. And when we talked about location of Canada and US, those are pretty much the closest you can get to the US in regards to similarities in culture based off location. So a kind of a re-examination needs to be done here in a kind of an exploratory nature, as this is the only study we could find that actually looked at that specific population in their transition out.
Thanks, Nick. So we have a purpose of this study. So the purpose of this study is twofold. The first one is to examine whether the antecedent factors listed in the earlier ISA's adjustment model still represent the best indicators of successful transition to college for international student athletes. And the second purpose of this study is to investigate the post-college transition for former international student athletes. And specifically, we have two different research questions. The first one is, do the adjustment model antecedent factors help explain the life experiences related to transition for international student athletes into US colleges? And in terms of research question 2, as Nick stated before, there is a lack of research regarding former international student athletes transitioning out of the college. So the research question 2 was more about the exploratory nature. Next, methodology. So for this study, in-depth and semi-structured interviews were employed. And due to the COVID pandemic, due to the situation, all interviews were conducted virtually via online platform Zoom. And there was a total of 10 former and current Division I women's tennis player were participated in this study. And in terms of the sampling technique, due to the uniqueness of the population, both convenience and snowball sampling was utilized for this study. An interview guide used for this study was modified from the past works from Riedinger and Pastor study and Pops et al. Study. And in addition, former student athletes were asked an extra subset of questions at the end of the interview, such as what has been the hardest challenge in your transition out of college? And in terms of data analysis, inductive coding and thematic analysis was employed for this study. So specifically, thematic analysis allowed researchers to organize a data set to identify patterns of meanings and themes across the data set. And these are the detailed information about our participants. So before the data analysis, our names are given to pseudonyms to protect the privacy of participants. And as I said just previous the slide, there was a total of 10 former and current Division I women's player participating in this study. And the sample represented 5 separate Division I schools, and participants hailed from 7 different countries, including 4 continents. So I will turn it over to Nick again for the result part.
Awesome, thanks, Youngjik. And so getting into research question 1, the overarching theme that we found from all participants was language. And not surprising, understanding this process of, I think there was only 1 participant that was a native English speaker prior to coming into the US. So first kind of sub-theme from language was barriers to academics. And when we saw this barrier to academics, it was this interesting transition in regards to understanding academia type writing and academia type language in comparison to what maybe the sport language would be, because a sport language is a little bit more transferable. A backhand's a backhand, a forehand is a forehand. And so those transitions were a little bit easier in the sports setting, but when it came to academics, we saw a little bit of a harder challenge, especially in writing, especially in reading. One participant who is now a coach said one of her student athletes currently is from Japan, and she had to translate her entire textbook to help process through the material that was being covered that week. So obviously that is a huge negative if we think about time, as we talked about, in regards to the extra time international student athletes have to actively engage in academia to be more successful maybe in a comparison to domestic student athletes. Next, barriers to relationships. And this one was important, especially in that first semester and first year, in regards to interpersonal relationships, specifically with teammates. Our student athlete or international student athletes from this study kind of expressed a desire to be part of the little conversations, right? In between drills and practice, maybe walking to class or on the bus on the way to a match. And they missed out on those because they felt like they were almost missing the joke. And a good quote from Claire here was, a lot of times I felt, language barrier. I would not understand the joke or whatnot and like be awkward. So they talked about this expression of not getting the joke. And so that is as we think about our personal relationships we have, usually those can help kind of mitigate some of those awkward experiences in that process. Next one, which is really important, which is lines, is there was improvement over time. And a lot of our participants talked about bringing little translator books with them or like recorders that can help translate in this space. However, they said once they got to this after the first semester, they didn't need those anymore. And so while it is a really significant barrier that exists at the beginning of their experience, it might not be later on. And so maybe if there's a way to help mitigate that at the forefront, might lead to better initial experiences on college campuses. Next theme is support. And so when we think about support, the first indication that was indicated by all the participant was coaches. And this is head coaches and assistant coaches, because as we said, there's variability in the recruiting process of who is discussing coming to campuses at the forefront. And so coaches we're seen as kind of the second parent, right? They're the person that you go to in your at the university, at the college, if you are struggling with something. So really important that coach is a strong mentor slash kind of support system for international student athletes. Next one was teammates. And it was obviously the team environment was talked about a lot. It was actually interesting too, was the introduction of other student athletes here. And our sample talked a lot about how other student athletes were going through similar things as them, and they could really connect with them. And maybe it was away from their sport, so they could almost discuss things a little bit more openly in that space, which is very unique. Next is the non-student athlete. And this was, again, unique because they talked about the non-student athletes in regards to maybe being more academic focused. And so this participant, Sarah, talked about her experience of wanting to study and wanting to be interactive with non-student athletes because they were more focused on studying. They were more focused on what their grades were in their class, where Sarah was really focused on that as well. A unique finding from this study, and we have faculty here, and if we look at the model on the right for the antecedent factors, faculty and staff maybe represents more of an athletic department faculty and staff. Here, we're talking about academic faculty. And two participants in our study specifically said that faculty members pushed them to one get a master's degree and one get a PhD. But when we talked about it, they said when faculty was interactive with them in regards to travel schedules, open office hours, pre-COVID, all of these different aspects were really important to their academic experience. While academic support are great, professors themselves might need to be in this process to help foster a better transition process. Theme 3 is campus experience, so busy schedule and time commitment. As we all know, college athletics is not a 20 hours a week experience. So they all talked about how this transition at first, especially in regards to educational model, did lead to some tough times, especially in regards, as we talked about language barrier, needing to spend more time on academics. Next, academic experiences. Uniquely here, we saw different experiences at the high school level. So as we talked about, obviously, home countries are going to have different variability in their school offerings. So we had some students that were on the side, well, if college here is easy because my high school is so hard, and others on the other side of my high school experience was easy, this is hard. So understanding that international student athletes are individual is important in understanding academic experiences. Next, cultural differences. One really unique finding here was food. And we think about food and the nutritional value, and we see a lot of athletic departments adding nutritionists into their athletic department, but they talked about the difference from their home country to the US in regards to food consumption, especially for international student athletes who spend a lot more time on campus because the lack of transportation might have this variability in their food offerings that they can have. Last theme here for research question 1 was athletic experience. So the first part of this was team culture. A lot of so this might not be generalizable to the entire population of international student athletes, but tennis players here had this idea that they played individually before, and they were competing in tournaments, and if they lost, they would go home. However, in the US, their college system, if they lost, their team could still win. And so what that looked like in regards to your athletic participation, you can lose but still win the match. That changes a lot of your perspective and your technical competencies and your self-efficacy. And lastly, for this, confidence level. So coaching at the international student athlete level was different from their experience past to present. So before, you would have maybe one coach working with you specifically. Here in the US, you have one assistant coach, maybe two. And then you have 12 to 13 to 15 players in your team. So you're not getting that individual coaching, which kind of decreased confidence levels for a lot of our participants in this space. Next to research question 2, we had theme 1, which is career readiness, and this discussed academics. So a lot of our participants actually talked about the readiness of themselves into a career based off of their academic experience. And this could be for many different reasons. Maybe they're engaging in faculty more, as we found in that transition into college, but they discussed the importance of academics aligning with what they're actually doing in their real world experience, which from our perspective as academia, definitely a positive. Next was the lack of internships, and they talked a lot about the importance of internships. A couple took on internships after they graduated because they didn't have time during their time, but they talked about internships as being a really positive experience of getting that real world experience. So something that could help mitigate these maybe more negative transitions could be internships in this process. Next is theme 2, how do I do life? As we can imagine, we give student athletes a lot. And when we give them a lot, that means that they don't have to do a lot of different things for themselves, like pay bills, buy their own clothes, because if we think about the gear that they get, a lot of different variability in food options. Here's your meal plan, go get food, having to make your own food. And so they talk similarly to domestic student athletes, how do I do life once I get done? And a lot of them talked about initially it was hard, but they started to figure it out a little bit more. Theme 3 was lack of movement, which is going from 15,000 to 20,000 steps a day to sitting in an office for 10 hours a day, sitting in front of a computer for 10 hours a day. Really had, and this would be kind of to that athletic identity crisis here, lack of movement is something I identify highly with, is moving and not doing it now is affecting negatively in this transition. And lastly, support. And this support actually looks different than what we would suspect. This support was more focused on documentation and the support of help getting that job instead of interpersonal relationships and support, which is very unique for the international student athletes and very unique in comparison to domestic student athletes in this process. And they talked about the need to get your green cards or get that visa so you can stay in the US to participate in maybe more school and or a work experience in that process. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hums.
Okay, and I will wrap this up here. And I don't know, there we go, thank you. So just talking about the transitions, first of all, the transition into college, we did confirm a lot of the findings from the adjustment model previously, but some factors did not enter in with our study. Our participants didn't talk about travel experience or adventure. Those were not in there. However, they did talk more about the involvement of faculty. And so I think that's important for all of us who are faculty members to keep in mind what we can do to help the international student athletes with their transitions both into and out of university. I think to no surprise, the first year was the hardest in the transition process. That would be typical whether you're a domestic student or an international student, moving somewhere new, meeting new people, and now making the adjustment to a new country and being on a team, having to speak a different language for the non-English speakers, and then just being integrated into campus generally. And then getting support from other international students, kind of a double-edged sword. It's like you want to hang out with them as a student athlete, but that takes away time from your being a student athlete. So how do you balance that? Next slide, please. Now then there's the transition out of college. Now we look at that transition into college, which for international student athletes is a little more complex. And because of having experienced that may mitigate some of the negative experiences of the transition out. They're used to making these sort of difficult cultural transitions. But again, this is something that we need to look at more. There's not a lot of evidence right now, so we have to see. I think that would be something that would be a good follow-up. The internship opportunities, like Nick mentioned, whether do I do my internship in the US? Do I may have to get my OPT, whatever might happen there. Do I want to go home? And yet they recognize the importance of internships. And similar to domestic student athletes is this issue of loss of athlete identity. These student athletes, they've been athletes all their lives. And now suddenly for some of them that go home, they may continue to play perhaps, but others will not. And so what do I do now? Instead of at practice, I'm at a desk all day. So that identity issue. Next, please. Next slide, please, Nick. So what can we do to create a better system? well, perhaps there's something we can do to make sure that international student athletes are more versant in English when they arrive. We talked about that. Anybody who's lived in another country knows what it's like that you hear something in a different language, you put it back into your language, and then you put it into the native language. That takes time and energy. And how can we help student athletes not have to make that transition so much? The food, we don't often think about the food, but all of a sudden you're in a new country. It's like, what is on my plate? And what is this good for me? Is this what I should be eating for training? So I think that's really important and something that's maybe been overlooked is this idea of health and nutrition. And then looking at emphasizing the importance of faculty relationships. Would it have been different? Our population was all females. Would this have been different with an all male population, for example? Female athletes tend to have higher GPAs than male athletes. So how would that perhaps have changed? So those are some things that we can look at as we go forward. So the next slide, I think, Nick. So we want to say thank you, vielen Dank, for listening. And if you have any questions, there's our emails. You can follow up with any of us, and we would be glad to answer your questions. So thank you very much for your attendance today, and we look forward to hearing from you. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you.